If you want to move intellectual science forward, use your brain to the top of its ability. And to use your brain at the top of its ability, you need to embrace magic.
Welcome to Back to the Future podcast. My name is Victor Sadia, and I talk with brilliant minds and hearts of people who want to uproot and transform the current health and wellness paradigm. Dr. Daniel Lieberman is a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at George Washington University. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and is the co-author of the international bestseller The Molecule of More. His second book, Spellbound, Modern Science, Ancient Magic, and the Unconscious Mind, explores the intersection of neuroscience and mysticism as it relates to our experience of our unconscious. In this episode, we discuss the necessity for scientists to embrace the realm of magic in understanding the complexities of the human mind. Drawing on ancient wisdom and modern science, Dr. Lieberman unravels how storytelling, fairy tales, and the unconscious mind offer profound insights into human behavior and cognition. We think through stories, and so, without stories, interdependent life would not be even possible. Our human biology demands stories to keep surviving and evolving. With thought-provoking insights and anecdotes, Lieberman advocates for a holistic approach to understanding the human psyche, urging paradigm shifters to embrace the magic within and beyond scientific inquiry. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today we have Dr. Daniel Lieberman. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you have been in many podcast conversations before. What is it that you like about podcast conversations and what you dislike about these conversations?
I just love scientific philosophical discussions. I went to a very unusual school for my undergraduate work called St. John's College. We read the great books there, the most important works of Western civilization, no textbooks, only original sources, no exams, no lectures. We read the work, we read the work, we sat around a table, we discussed it, and intellectually, those were the best years of my life.
Yes, let's talk about that, because we tend to think about school, about this structure system with exams, textbooks, and following a canon. And going to books written 2,000 years ago doesn't seem very up to date, But sometimes those ideas are even more up to date than the newest thing. How was it for you to see that?
It was absolutely wonderful. I always knew I wanted a career in science. And Isaac Newton's words, "The reason I can see so far is because I stand on the shoulders of giants," resonated with me. And I felt that if I wanted to be in a situation to push this science forward, I really needed a firm base. And I needed to start with the authors that all of my scientific heroes had read. And that takes us all the way back to the ancient Greeks, Homer, Plato, Aristotle. And we can say these are old, outdated ideas, but I think they're not, because they're really about teaching us how to think rigorously, how to look beyond the superficial and dig deeply. And of course, St. John's is not the only place where these works are read. And you have to ask yourself, if they're still being read after 2,000 years, they must be pretty important.
Yeah. And how was your decision to go into medical school? Because for me, it's not obvious. If you read those books, your next decision will be to study medicine.
I've always been interested in science. In high school, science and math were my best subjects. But when I graduated from St. John's, I had this very broad liberal arts education, and I wasn't quite sure what the next step was. So I was at a loose end. A friend of mine who was born in Japan said, "Hey, go to Japan." This was in 1985, the height of the bubble economy, and their trade was taking off, and everybody in business needed to learn English because that was the language of trade. And my friend said, "Anyone with a college degree can get a job teaching English." I went, had a wonderful time. While I was there, I picked up a book by Carl Jung, Man and His Symbols, and I was floored. I felt that this brought together all of the philosophical ideas that I had been studying and looked at it from a psychology point of view, which was so exciting to me. And I thought, I want to be a Jungian analyst. Returning to the United States, I went back to my school to talk to one of my former professors who was a mentor. And he said, "Dan, the most exciting advances right now are in the biological sphere." I think if you want to take care of people's minds, you need to learn about their brains. You need to go to medical school. And I took his advice, and in retrospect, I think he was right.
Wow. I studied economics, and one thing my uncle always said is that even if you're not very interested in the subject, economics and mathematics will structure your mind. And I'm sure this happens with all careers, engineering, art, and certainly medicine. How do you think not only the topics and contents of medicine, but the structuring on how your mind would think after you finished medical training? How was this structure really played out in your life?
If we talk specifically about psychiatry, one of the things it taught me is humility. When there are things that we don't know, we reason to try to figure it out. We develop hypotheses, and we work off of those hypotheses until we have the evidence we need to know for sure. And one of the things I've noticed in psychiatry is that oftentimes the things that appear to be reasonable are not actually true. The evidence is constantly surprising us. And so it really taught me that when there isn't enough evidence, we have no choice. We've got to speculate. But we always have to remember those speculations are tentative, and we always should pursue evidence to try to know for sure.
Yeah, and that's a tricky word, reason, right? But because if you reason things out, it doesn't mean they are correct. But that's counterintuitive, even through a reasonable, structured mind.
There's two kinds of reasoning, at least two kinds. One is deduction, and deductions are certain. Example of deduction, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Absolutely not in doubt. But then there's inference. Deduction goes from general rules to specific instances, and that's certain. Inference goes from specific instances to general rules, and that's never certain. So, for example, in medicine, we'll test a drug and we'll test it on 200 people, and it works. So we say, all right, now we're going to assume that it will work for the population at large. Maybe. That's an inference. We don't know for sure. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes drugs that get FDA approval, regulatory approval, turn out that they actually don't work very well because the population they were tested in was different in some ways from the general population. And you know that as an economist, right? The statistics. We don't say that we're 100% sure in this conclusion. We say we're 95% sure, and that's good enough. So I think it's important to know the nature of the tool that you're working with and its limitations. And reason certainly has limitations.
Yeah. And, one of the ways that science work is through deduction and through, in a sense, also separating in different areas and disciplines and sub-sciences, the methodologies to understand the world. And that's why we have hard and soft sciences. We have physics, biology, chemistry, but we also have the social science. And in a sense, I always have this feeling that these categories are somewhat arbitrary, and that the physical, the biological, the chemical, the social, dare I say, the emotional and the spiritual are very mixed and intertwined. And nevertheless, we don't have the cognitive apparatus to bring together all the knowledges, the specific knowledges that we have all around. As I see you as an interdisciplinary, even, dare I say, spiritual scientist. How your mind has evolved to try to bring together these languages and show that there's the possibility of a coherent whole.
Yeah. There was a time in human history when an educated person could know all the knowledge that was to be known. Back in the Middle Ages, maybe the Renaissance. Now, of course, that's impossible. And so we tend to specialize. And the farther we go in a science, the more and more specialized we become. So there are people who are specialized in just one teeny tiny area of the brain and know next to nothing about all the rest of it. So it becomes harder. There is a sense that all knowledge is one. It's in some ways a mystical concept, but in other ways, it's not. It all hangs together. And so I find it very, very fruitful to look for the connections. The connections, I think, is sometimes where the discoveries pop out. That something seems completely unrelated to this field. When you start to think about it in the new context, you suddenly realize, oh my God, yes, it is related. And it enables you to make new progress. So I think that as we become more and more specialized, it becomes more difficult, but it's an enormously valuable thing to do if you can meld these things together.
How have you done it so far in your career? If you see that, if you're interested in doing so, but the academic system is not really wired for you to pursue those things. In your life, both professionally and personally, how have you systematically looked for those connections and made beautiful breakthroughs in a sense?
Yeah, I've done it the easy way. The easiest thing to do is to pursue your passion, to pursue the things that you are interested in. And fortunately, I do have pretty wide interests. So in addition to medicine, another thing I'm very interested in is technology. And I recently kind of shifted careers to bring those two things together. But my entire life, I have absolutely loved literature. I think that literature is so valuable. There have been studies that show that people who read fiction are mentally healthier than those who do not. People who read fiction tend to be more empathic, because when you read a novel, you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But there is, in science, the only thing you see pretty much is what the scientist intended to put in there. It's very precise, excluding everything else. In literature, that's not true. In literature, the author often puts things in that they don't even know is in there, because stories just spontaneously arise through inspiration. People sometimes talk about their muse. So literature is incredibly rich, and I feel that by keeping up with that, it enables me to think more broadly, more flexibly.
I love this because, yes, in a sense, these are literature. It's almost like it's a verbal, but also a non-verbal way of communicating. When you say something that you didn't know you were saying it while writing a novel, even a short story. And I think, in a sense, we know this world is so complex in terms of the amount of information and interconnections and interdependence that are all around. And science can give us a lot of numbers and statistics and things that say, wow, that's huge, but we don't really understand what a million is, a billion. It's too much for us in a sense. And stories do convey this. It's more like a sensation rather than just a meaning, than there's something beyond and beyond and beyond all the time happening.
Yeah, that's exactly true. We can ask ourselves, which is worse, one person going hungry or 1,000 people going hungry? Well, it's obvious. It's 1,000 people going hungry. But charities have found that if they send out mailers asking for donations, and they see this terrible tragedy, 5,000 people are starving, they get fewer donations than if they just tell a story about one person. Our brains are wired for stories, less so for statistics. And those are the things that have an impact on us and will get us to take action and change the way we do things.
I love this. I love when you say our biology is wired for stories. It even demands stories to exist, to create life. Tell me about this. In your book, you talk about the evolution of stories through natural selection and how stories really shaped at least human, not only behavior, but human life. Our biology evolved through the stories and it made us who we are today.
Yeah, so just to say a few more words about stories. We think with stories. We don't realize we're doing that, but as we go through life, we are weaving narratives about the things that happen to us. And if it doesn't fit within the narrative, we'll often exclude it and have no memory that it even happened. As a physician, if I can just take a brief detour here, I'm constantly fighting this battle, okay? The way the administrators want to present information to us is just as raw data, okay? What symptoms are you feeling? Boom, a list of symptoms. How old are you? Age, answer, weight, answer, symptoms, answer, history, answer. You read that and it doesn't stick in your brain, right? Whereas traditionally, psychiatrists record a patient encounter through a narrative, almost making it into a story. This is a 35-year-old single man who presents with 6 weeks of depression. Recently, he got divorced, et cetera, et cetera. And then it all makes sense and you remember it. And this is what we do spontaneously as we go through life. Just as we don't process individual photons in order to see, we process shapes and colors. We don't process individual events. We weave them into stories in order to understand them.
I love how answering the question involved telling a story about
That's
the
right. Yeah.
story so that you can convey your point. And
Yeah.
that's beautiful in a sense. Tell me about tell me about a moment when you realized that you were reading a story or recounting an already known stories from your culture or whatever, and you really saw that it was talking about many more things than what the story was telling itself. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things I talk a lot about in the book, and something that is important to me, is fairy tales. I think that fairy tales are examples of stories that have the most richness and depth. And to explain why that is, we can go back to your previous question, the evolution of stories. Traditional fairy tales, as we read, for example, in Grimm's collection or other collections, who are they written by? There's no author. There's no author. These stories began in the oral tradition. And typically it was women who told them while they were spinning yarn. And that's where we get the saying to spin a tale. Do you have that? Yeah.
Not quite, but yeah, I get the
Yeah,
point.
it's an English
Yeah,
expression to spin a
yeah.
tale or spin a yarn. That's telling a story. And so when you have a story that is in the oral tradition, it mutates the way genes mutate as time goes by. So somebody may hear the story and go, "Oh my God, I love that story. I'm going to tell it to my group." And it's told, and it's not going to be word for word exactly the same. It's going to reflect that person's personality. It's also going to reflect the reaction of the audience. The things that resonate with the audience will be maintained and maybe even expanded upon. The things that don't will be discarded. And so, like natural selection allows organisms to become fitter and fitter for their environment, the oral tradition allows stories to become more and more powerful representations of the human mind. And so, what happens is when you read a fairy tale, superficially, it can seem like a very simple story. You got some characters, they face some problems, and you got a happy ending. And then often what you find is the story haunts you. And you find that for days, weeks, maybe even longer, it keeps recurring. It's doing something to you. Sometimes it may give you strange feelings, maybe very positive. It makes you feel alive, or maybe it makes you feel kind of warm and safe and comfortable. It can also give you negative feelings, fear, anxiety, uncertainty. And that's because as a result of this natural evolution, these stories have become very powerful representations of a part of the mind that we don't have contact with, the unconscious mind.
Yeah, and that's why I think we are very brave, you know, to talk about magic and mysticism in science book. I love the entry door that you use, which is psychology and symbols and the unconscious as the mirror of the magic that we are in a sense. How have you come to reconcile this idea that magic and science are separate? And when you look it through your perspective, it's not so.
Yeah, yeah. So magic is a class of stories, right? We have all of these stories about magic, from Tolkien's Middle Earth to the Disney fairy tales, Harry Potter, and these are very, very resonant with us. And I think that we have to ask ourselves, why is that? On the surface, it seems as if stories about magic have nothing to do with the real world. And yet, if that were true, I don't think that we would be interested in them. And what I think these stories about magic are a way of understanding the unconscious parts of our mind, sort of as a shorthand. And this is not at all unusual in science. We're always using stories in science. In psychiatry, someone comes in, they've got depression, and we say, "I want to prescribe you a medication." "Why do you want to prescribe me a medication, doctor?" "Well, it's because depression is a result of a chemical imbalance in your brain." You ever hear that? It's not
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
It's not true at all. But it makes sense. It's a good story. It helps people understand that what they're experiencing is psychological, perhaps spiritual, but also biological. And there's some truth to it, that there are chemicals involved. Let me give you another example. If I say this table I'm sitting at is solid, that's a story. It's not true. It's not solid at all. It's 99% empty space if you know anything about how atoms work. But that's not helpful to say this table is empty space. And it would be exhausting to constantly think about things as being both empty space, but acting. So forget about it. Let's just tell the story. These things are solids. And it's wrong. It's not scientific, but it's practical and it's useful and it's valuable. And it will make our lives better because we won't be smashing our heads against solid walls thinking they're 99% empty space. And the same is true with magic. We know these stories are not true, but they represent a truth that cannot be explained in any better way. It is an extremely efficient, useful, and valuable way, just like the solidity of tables. And I think that that's why these stories have lasted for so many years. If you think about the stories we tell today, all of the oldest ones have supernatural characteristics to them because these are the most important stories that we have.
Wow, I love how you explain. And let's talk about the supernatural in a sense, because magic allows us to see something that it's supernatural, that it's metaphysical in a sense, which even science, when it studies the atom or it studies the cell, there, even if we would be able to describe all the interactions and things that happen inside a cell or an atom, it still feels like something is supernatural. And yet science doesn't like to use those terms. It believes that someday it will be able to describe everything and to put it into a spreadsheet, a huge spreadsheet, obviously.
That's right. Another word for a scientific approach is a materialist approach. If you know anything about the standard model of physics, we've got fermions, that's what makes up matter. We've got bosons, that's what makes up physical force. And that's it. That's all there is. There are no souls, there are no gods, there are no goddesses, there are no sprites. And that's the scientific view, the materialist view. As a scientist, I like to work within that materialist view. I don't believe it. I believe in human souls, but there's no evidence for that. And so I'm not going to write about that because I write as a scientist. And so I believe that magic can be studied and understood from a scientific perspective. And for me, in some ways, that's the most exciting way to talk about it, because I feel that sometimes when you abandon the scientific perspective, you get into all this hand waving, vibrations and stuff that strikes me as kind of nonsensical. And so I like the scientific view. And we can talk about why magic is so important by looking at things from a psychological point of view, looking at studies that show people function better when they believe in magic. For example, we need magic when we are in situations that we don't have control over. And so people are most likely to engage in superstition when they're in situations that have great uncertainty and the stakes are very high. So a lot of people have a lucky shirt or some lucky charm or a lucky tie. They're most likely to turn to this when they're faced with a big exam, a first date, a job interview. If you look at people in our society for whom the stakes are highest and they have the least control, you might say it's professional athletes. They can train to make themselves better. They can practice, but on a given day, they never know where they're going to give an inspired performance in which it's just an amazing display of athletic prowess, or they're going to drop the ball and look like an absolute idiot. And so they are very superstitious. Athletes in general are more superstitious than non-athletes. Elite athletes are even more superstitious, and professional athletes are the most superstitious of all. If you Google professional athlete superstition, you'll see all kinds of crazy stuff. And the best known athletes are the ones with the craziest superstitions.
That's amazing. And at the same time, if we take this evolutionary lens, it is selecting that those superstitions keep arising because they are useful. They are making you the world champion. And in a sense, it has impacts on biology, on brain chemistry, on performance. I'm not only talking about athletes, but even if you are superstitious about taking a sugar pill, a placebo, it will have an effect on the brain and on the physiology.
A measurable effect. We can measure the changes in physiology, and that's a form of magic.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the next beautiful and very open frontiers for medicine to study, because I tend to see that those effects are not, we don't have the languages to studying them deeply. We just measure the effect and say they're there, but why and how they are happening, you know? When you use a scientific lens to talk about magic and superstition, the more we develop the tools and the languages from science perspectives, obviously, to understand those these things will be reclaimed as scientific, physical, chemical things that are happening, which I think is very exciting, as you say.
Yeah, yeah. I think that one of the most important scientific bases of magic is that the largest part of our brain that we have is devoted to social interactions. And there's a very good evolutionary reason for that. It doesn't matter how big, strong, or smart an individual is. If that individual wants to fight a gang, he's going to lose. Right? People cooperating together are always going to be more effective than any individual. And so in order for our species to survive, it was very, very beneficial for us to be able to cooperate. And so if you look at evolution, what you see is the size of the brain grows through the different hominids, and the size of the group grows as well. And there is a direct relationship between brain size and group size, which is a strong indication that the reason our brains got large is so that we could function in these large groups. So, all right, so we got all this brain power developed to social interactions. We might as well use the tool that we have. And so as you become more and more skilled at some kind of profession or some kind of craft, you're more and more likely to personify the thing that you are working on. So, for example, auto mechanics, they treat engines as if they were sentient. Right? I don't know about you. I used to have this old car. Sometimes it would start, sometimes it wouldn't. And if I had to go on this really important appointment, I'd stick it in. I'd say, please start. I had a relationship with this car. And usually when it was very important, it would start. And if it wouldn't, I would become angry with it, as if it were intentionally causing problems for me. And so because our brains evolved for these social interactions, we tend to have social relationships with inanimate objects. And in many ways, that is the basis of magic, the things around us being alive.
I want to take that last sentence, the feeling of inanimate things, they are alive, And in a sense, we live in an era where there's a lot of social problems, social differences, social wars. And we have also a lot of ecological devastation because we see a tree or we see water and we see it as inert, as a resource and not something that is living and that makes us live, and that we are those things at the end of the day. And yet science doesn't like to talk about animism and doesn't like to talk about aliveness in all those things. But I don't see a future of humanity, because life will carry on without us, that's for sure. But humanity, without having some sort of magical animistic thinking about not only for your car, who needs to get you to your appointment, but the snail that it's just walking around your terrace, and the tree that it's making you breathe, and your neighbor that has another skin color or another religion, and yet it is still part of you. How do you think about these things in the context of the Anthropocene?
I just want to, it's a hard question. And so give me some time to think about it. I want to focus on a detail. Scientists don't like magic. That's what they say, but that's not what they do. Scientists practice magic. Okay. So doctors are scientists, and they talk about aggressive tumors. Tumors aren't aggressive. They don't have any emotions. Particle physicists, maybe the purest scientists in the world, if they have difficulty finding a subatomic particle, they describe it as being shy, right? Why do they do this? The reason they do it is because it helps them understand the science better. If you want to move intellectual science forward, use your brain to the top of its ability. And to use your brain at the top of its ability, you need to embrace magic. So shy particles and aggressive tumors are easier to understand than trying to conceptualize them in a non-animistic way. But if you ask scientists, do you believe it's fruitful to think about your work in mystical ways? They'll say, oh my God, absolutely not. And so to get back to your question, I think we all need to be a little bit more realistic. The tree huggers, I think they need to learn how to express what they're feeling in scientific terms, because they will be better accepted that way. The scientists, they need to accept that regardless of what they say, they are acting in a magical way. Scientists don't study magic, but I think they should. And that's another way of saying they should study psychology. And I think that if we all had a better understanding of both sides of the equation, we could communicate better, and maybe we could come together more to solve these very, very difficult problems that are tearing us apart and threatening our environment.
What are the things that keep you awake at night while, let's say, when you were writing Spellbound? And what are the kinds of things that kept you awake while developing the ideas and the structure for the book?
So, first of all, I realized that there was so much I did not know. I went into that task of writing the book thinking I knew more than I did. But you don't know what you don't know until you try to explain it to somebody else. In addition, the other work I do, I'm also a teacher. I teach at George Washington University. And one of the reasons I love that is because it keeps me on my toes. Students will ask me questions that I don't know the answer to. And so first of all, I keep up with my reading to minimize that. And second, I get in the habit of saying, I don't know. I'm going to need to go look that up. And when I was writing this book, there was so much that I didn't know. So I had to do that. The next thing was that I had to overcome the expert's curse. The expert's curse is when somebody who knows a lot about the subject can't conceive what it's like for somebody who doesn't know a lot about the subject. If you tap the rhythm to a well-known song, like Happy Birthday to You, right? Happy birthday. You tap it, it sounds painfully obvious what it is. You tap it to somebody else, I don't know what the heck those taps mean. That's an example of the expert's curse. It's hard to know how it feels not to know. So I had to try to explain it in a way that other people would understand. And then the third thing that I found incredibly difficult was the connections among the ideas. You know, after I did all my research, I did my outline, I had a list of things I wanted to say, but I had to make it into a story, and that required connections between the two. Obviously, you can't just present a bunch of facts, no matter how interesting those facts are. I needed to hook the reader, and I need to carry them through a narrative that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, conflict and resolution. And that was the most fun, but it was also the most difficult.
Yeah, when I write my books, the most difficult part for me is to visualize the narrative arc for the 200 pages that are going to get written. And for me, it's not a logical procedure to get there. It appears someday out of the unknown, and it suddenly makes sense. My mind, my unconscious, just shows the structure, you know? And I think these mixes, this verbal brain that we have with a non-verbal brain that we have, and downloads in a verbal structure. So yeah, how did you come up with the narrative arc to tell the story that made sense before you even started writing it?
In exactly the same way you did. It just came to me. And it wasn't one problem, it was 100 problems, this idea, that idea. And what I did is I kept a notebook next to my bed, because it was when my conscious mind, my rational analytic mind was letting go, that the inspiration could bubble up. And that was when I was in that twilight period between waking and sleeping. And horribly annoying, because that twilight period is so pleasant, right? As you're drifting off to sleep and you're like, all right, so long, here I go. But I go, oh, geez, that's such a great idea. I shake myself awake and write it down dozens and dozens of times. And that's where many of the problems I faced got solved.
Yeah, and extrapolating a bit, which isn't very scientific to do, or at least I don't know if we can claim a truth to it, but we're living in these dangerous times in a sense. That's also a story that I'm telling, obviously. But I do see, as we were talking about animism, and at least getting the feeling that everything is interconnected and alive, as humanity, as individuals, we need more of those states where we allow our systems to come together in that rational but not rational, intuitive but also scientific way of, let's use this word, understanding, and then use those insights to write a book, to relate better to your spouse, to build a business, to ask for forgiveness for something that you did, to plan a 6-year plan for your country, if you are on the government. And I don't see many people using these states enough to take decisions or to build structures for agendas.
It's getting worse and worse and worse. People really aren't reading books anymore. I wrote a collection of fairy tales and I sent it to my agents, and they said, "Oh my God, we love these. These are beautiful, evocative stories, and you can keep them because there's absolutely no market. There's no way we could sell them." It's like, oh my God. Instead of reading stories that will enrich their lives and make them better at interacting socially with other people, they're reading tweets, they're reading Instagram posts, they're watching TikTok videos. And instead of expanding the mind, these narrow the mind. Instead of making us think very deep thoughts, they make us think superficial thoughts. Instead of making us think about humanity as a whole, our connection to the whole universe, they make us focus on our selfish needs. And so we need a return to stories. We need to understand that there is more to life than the superficial. And if we want to be happy, if we want to be fulfilled, we need to do some work. We can't just watch TikTok videos. We need to struggle a little bit with meaning.
Yeah, and in a sense, those short-term activities, the pornographic nature of social media and the way we receive information, and we are that information in a sense, it strengthens the ego in a sense. It needs you to put boundaries and to compare yourself. And as you've talked about, to deal with the unconscious and to live with the power of the unconscious that has thousands of years of evolutionary pressures to maintain the human species alive, we need to surrender. We need to let go of that ego. And these short-term things, it's not allowing for us to do that. So yeah, and I feel trapped because it's really pervasive and it's really dopamine. You're the expert of dopamine. It's really engaging. It's an addiction that doesn't feel like an addiction. And then we're screwed because we cannot even name, because our cognitive processes and our judgments about those cognitive processes are being just sequestered, and we don't have free will in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's true. We think we have free will, and I think we do, but I think that we are buffeted by forces that often go against our free will. Some of those forces come from inside. I may want to do some work on my next book, but I'm just not interested in it. I'm just not passionate about it. And maybe I can force myself, but it's not going to be the same. Some of the forces are from the outside. Very simply, I may want to go to work, but if my car won't start, I can't. In a more sophisticated way, I may want to eat a healthy diet, but if I'm bombarded by advertisements for junk food and grocery store shelves full of sodas, it's going to be hard for me to exercise that free choice.
Yeah, it's a tragic trap. And, we can put some words into it. I still feel trapped into that. Tell me about, you've talked about the numinous experiences, the experiences of awe. And we are confounding those experiences with having a nice meme or having a nice 10-second video on our phones, just making us smile or laugh, And yet those profound experiences are deeply, they really transform who you are. And when they transform who you are, they transform your words, the way you relate to other people, the way you do business, the way you choose your career. And I feel that we have less and less the attention and the time and the mental freedom to just allow for those experiences to happen. It's not that you have to go and to the other side of the world and they're happening all the time. Potentially, you can observe the world through that lens, but we are anesthetized to receive it. Is there research on this or not really? Yeah,
there is. Surprisingly, there's a lot of scientific research on the mystical, and it's fascinating stuff. But yeah, in English, we call them magic moments. It's a magic moment. And a lot of times when people think of magic moments, they think of being a romantic scenario. And that definitely often happens, but it can happen in other situations as well. When we do have a magic moment, I think that the primary feeling is the feeling of being alive, right? If you've said, I've never felt more alive. All of a sudden, everything is more intense. Colors are brighter. Sounds are more musical. Everything is more important. And what's happening there is that we are connecting with our unconscious. That's where life comes from, and we can't control it. It comes as a gift. All of a sudden, you might be walking all alone and it's fall and you smell the fall leaves and boom, the whole world is transformed. You feel like there is this great truth just out of reach and your life is so enriched and you have this longing for something you don't know what you're longing for. And even though it's a feeling in some ways of incompleteness, I want this thing, it's also in other ways, the greatest joy that human beings are capable of. And as we pursue the latest cell phone, the fastest car, the newest whatever, we forget that those things don't really give us fulfillment. It's these magical moments that give us fulfillment. And maybe we should be structuring our lives around those rather than around, material goods.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear your words and say, yeah, I know that's true. Why aren't you seeking more of those experiences and knowing that those experiences are what all the other things that you are doing are to get to those moments. And those moments are available because you are it. It's not that you have to reach and to put a lot of effort into those things. And yet in those moments, you know you're doing the right thing. You're putting attention to the right things. But when we're not there, it's like, yeah, that would be fun, instead of knowing that all the things that you are, working and busting your ass off in whatever you're doing is because you want to get to those feelings. Yeah. Well, Daniel, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. My last question is around, I told you we are doing this Congress on lifestyle medicine, the power of sleeping and eating and regulating stress. And we called our Congress Abracadabra, with this idea of re-enchanting the basic things that we do every day from a scientific perspective. The thing that the magical thing in an organic carrot, when you chew on that carrot, or when you work on trauma and you resignify your trauma, it's magical how you get all your past changes in an instant, in a sense. Give me an advice on how to keep re-enchanting lifestyle through the magic that lifestyle is.
I would say read stories about magic. There's some great ones that have been written recently, but the old ones are the most powerful. The ancient myths and the fairy tales. Maybe not the Disney adaptations, maybe go back to Grimm. They are grim to some degree. You need to be a little bit careful with them. When I recommend fairy tales, I say read one. It's tempting to read through an anthology. Just read one and let it work on you. And for some people, it's too much. And I say, okay, put it down. You don't want to traumatize yourself, which these things can do because they're so deep. Read them, think about them, let them work on you, and then just pay attention. The magical part of the brain is the part of the brain that you don't have control over. And the way to pay attention to that is pay attention to thoughts that come into your mind spontaneously. Without you choosing to think about them. Pay attention to your emotions. You have no control over it. Sometimes it's obvious why you're happy or sad. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just say, I feel so happy today and I have no idea why. Pay attention. You might learn something valuable, something magical.
What can I say? Thank you for bringing this magic. A short conversation can be magical. It is magical in every sense, but even more when you are looking for the magic behind the magic. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Have a great day, my friend.
You too.